When I say recent book, I should actually preface that, because when I say that, it sounds quite presumptuous. I did actually write one other book. It came out in 1997, and I gave it the very page-turning title, The Humanitarian Impact of Economic Sanctions on Maternal and Child Health in Post-Coup Burundi. It went straight to paperback. And I want to thank, the 4 people who bought it, especially the 2 who were not my parents. But I should begin by saying that I am here this afternoon in my individual capacity and not as any official representative of a war child. And the views that I'm about to present to you are uniquely my own. So yes, indeed, it is going to be one of those speeches that requires me to begin with a disclaimer. Today's events have featured several outstanding and critical thinkers in the field of global health. So let me apologize in advance for being your only nut this afternoon. Stephen Lewis will be much wiser and sager than I am. And in this respect, I suspect that my comments this afternoon will deviate substantively from what you may have already heard here today, because I'm not going to be discussing evolving technologies or medical advances or looming pandemics or even access to medications as they relate to the advancement of global health, because those discussions are best left to the experts, and I am not one of them. Instead, I'm going to talk about the assumptions that we make when it comes to global health, which is paradoxically a nebulous as well as a very narrowly defined subject matter. And it is nebulous because it appears to capture everything from infectious disease management to vitamin A supplementation. And it is narrow because when we consider approaches to tackling global health, we often think of things such as maternal and child and infant mortality in the developing world, or if you prefer, the global south, and we fail to consider the most important variables of all. And we look to those quick fixes, and we look to new innovations, and we look to aid reallocation, for example, from Africa to Latin America. And we believe that this will make a difference, when in fact, in many instances, the most affordable, effective, and sustainable solutions are right in front of us. They are known, they are obvious, and they are easily implemented. So what do I mean by this? Because this is what I'm going to focus my comments on this afternoon. If I were to ask all of you here for a show of hands, and said to you, what do you think is the single most important determinant of whether a child in the developing world will live to see his or her 5th birthday? What would you think that is? How many of you would put up your hands and say, well, I think it would be widespread vaccination programs? How many of you would say that? That if we dramatically invested in vaccination programs, that would have the biggest impact on reducing infant and child mortality? Okay, so not many of you. How about if I said access to health care? That if we really invested money in making primary care available in the developing world, that this would have the biggest impact? A few of you. How about if I said mosquito nets? That if we invested in the widespread distribution of mosquito nets, that this would make the biggest difference? How many of you would put up your hands? A few of you. In actual fact, more people die in the developing world from smoke inhalation related to kerosene cook stoves and charcoal fires than die of malaria, even though this remains a significant killer. In fact, demographically speaking, while all of these health variables are important and do play a role, the single most important determinant, and this is well studied, of whether a child in the developing world will live to see his or her 5th birthday is that child's mother's independent access to income, which is specifically about education levels. A recent study by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that was published in The Lancet about 14 months ago found, and they looked at 30 years of demographic data, 30 years around girls and child mortality. And they found that for every additional year of education a girl in the developing world attains, on average, child mortality drops by 10%. So I'm going to say that again. For every additional year of education, child mortality drops by 10%. So we know convincingly that increased education levels, especially among girls, that this decreases infant and child and maternal mortality in the developing world. And we know that increased education levels, that these also reduce fertility rates and improve quality of life indicators all around the world. And we also know that increased education levels reduce the likelihood of violence and armed conflict. And yet, none of these answers fits into a narrowly defined clinical or medical view of global health. And this is often where we fall down, because global health isn't, in fact, a medical conundrum that needs to be solved. In my view, it is a narrative, and it is a narrative which is often poorly understood and incompletely told. And it is only when we begin to wrestle with that narrative that a more thoughtful and considered approach to global health begins to emerge. So now let's look at expanding that narrative around a major global health issue. Let's look at the ongoing problem of war. There are currently 26 conflicts raging around the world. And when it comes to war as a threat to community health and well-being, the last few months have been absolutely startling. Thousands dead in Syria, an estimated 100,000, mostly women and children, who died in last summer's famine in the Horn of Africa. Renewed and intensifying hostilities in eastern Congo, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Mali, to name but a few of these. And when we think of protecting and promoting global health in such violent contexts, we understandably defer to the most urgent needs. We think of food, and we think of water, and we think of shelter, and we think of blankets, and we think of mobile or temporary health clinics. And we are right to think about those initiatives because they do, in fact, save lives. And I'm certainly not proposing this afternoon that it is an either-or scenario here, but when it comes to making an impact on global health, we really cannot afford to stop there, because there is another inherently destabilizing force at play, and which is a major threat to global health around the world, and which will be particularly important in 2012. So what is that destabilizing force? Well, I'm going to ask all of you this here. How many AK-47s do you think that there are in the world right now? Who wants to shout out a number? Who thinks it's more than 100 million? Who thinks it's more than 200 million? When you consider the ones that we know about, so the ones that are legally traded, the World Bank estimates that there are roughly 200 million Kalashnikov rifles in existence in the world today. And if you extend that to all small arms, that number goes up to roughly 1 billion. And a small arm is literally anything you can pick up and carry. So it includes things like rocket launchers and machine guns. And how much do you think you can buy an illegal automatic weapon for on a parallel market in a developing country? How many of you think it would be, most of the time, more than $100? You're absolutely right. On average, it is between $30 and $60, and these can be bought for as little, when you think about it, as the price of admission to most American and Canadian theme parks. These are indestructible, lightweight, child-friendly. They're child-friendly because they're easy for kids to load and reload. Steel-killing machines that are capable with a clip of firing up to 600 rounds in less than 1 minute. I'll say that again, 600 rounds in less than 1 minute. And when it comes to global health, we should ask ourselves, well, who's buying these weapons that are a major destabilizing force around the world? Well, for the last 6 or 7 years, roughly 70% of all weapons that were sold in the world were purchased by developing countries. And where do you think 90% of those weapons come from? Who wants to shout out some places? United States, about half of them. Russia, China, Britain, France, increasingly Germany. Canada is seventh on that list, and we have one of the lowest arms transparency ratings in the developed world in terms of knowing where our arms are going and what they're being used for. But roughly 90% of those weapons come from the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Annual worldwide military spending right now exceeds $1.53 trillion. That is the highest point after adjusting for inflation since World War II. And in recent years, the combined arms sales of the world's top 100 arms manufacturers, those profits have soared to more than $400 billion a year, which actually represents a 60% increase over the past decade alone. And I'm sure I don't need to remind all of you here that some of those shipments included ones that went to the now deposed Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, who was the second largest recipient of American military aid, or that the European Union, since sanctions were lifted against Gaddafi in 2004, approved over $1 billion in arms export licensing agreements to the always deranged and now deceased former dictator. And some of those arms that went to Libya are now actively flowing to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is the militant youth movement, and to Aqim, the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Small arms do not recognize borders. This is why they are a major threat to global health around the world, which guarantees that their first stop will never be their last. Even Mikhail Kalashnikov has expressed regret that he did not invent a lawnmower instead. It's true. You know, globally, we invest 10 times as much money fighting one another as we do on official or overseas development assistance, on these kinds of global health innovations, ensuring that children in other corners of the world have the opportunity to be fed, to go to school, to have access to clean drinking water, and to receive vaccination. And the acceptability of this line of thinking is unfortunately deeply embedded in our national character. You know, the biggest cutback that took place in the recent federal budget was to foreign aid spending, which will see our levels drop to about 0.26% of our national wealth within the next few years. And we as Canadians, unfortunately, reap the profits of this growing industry. And I'm going to ask all of you here a question. How many of you in this room have ever received a paycheck? And how many of you have paid CPP deductions? The ones that didn't put up your hand, let me tell you, you're about to be audited. this is being filmed for TVO. Sorry about that. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board has more than $200 million invested in the world's top 100 arms manufacturers, as does virtually every single provincial teacher's pension fund in this country. So when we talk about global health, when we consider what kind of approaches are effective or might be effective in failed states such as Somalia, what changes might we advocate for here? Well, for one thing, we really must start looking at issues of arms control, not as distinct from health, but as absolutely integral to it. And this means, for example, coming out strongly in favor this year of the efforts at the Security Council to bring about an arms trade treaty, the ATT, that would actually restrict the manufacturing, the transfer, the supply, and stockpiling of small arms in the world. And if you want information on this, I would encourage you to visit the website is controlarms.org or go to Project Plowshares for more information, because unfortunately, while we as Canadians, we were at one point at the fore of these conversations and debates and discussions in relation to the arms trade treaty, unfortunately we have taken a slightly different turn and approach on this issue recently, and it is one that we really desperately need to be aware of, because small arms continue to be lethal to civilians all around the world. And these are some of the ways in which we can continue to improve global health by advocating for stronger policy measures directly tied to social justice interventions. And that is certainly not to say that those responsible for organizing and orchestrating such malicious attacks on civilians, such as the now convicted Liberian warlord Charles Taylor, it's not to suggest that they are not culpable for their actions. But we must also recognize, and this is something I have come to understand over the past 20 years of doing work in this field since I graduated from medical school. Now, for those of you trying to do the math on that, I'm 42, let's all move on. But it isn't enough. It isn't enough to continue inventing new and better Band-Aids. We must look to understand this broader narrative, and we must stop believing that global health is about the lives we saved, the hospitals we built, or the months we spent overseas. You know, these are some of the ways in which we can advance global health through stronger policy measures without ever even getting on a plane. And I'm going to give you another example very briefly. You know, one of the worst places to live in the world right now is the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a conflict that has killed more than 5 million people since 1997. And within the Congo, young men in particular have been abducted and recruited and implicated in some of the most egregious human rights violations of the 21st century. I first met a young woman whose name I have changed in order to protect her. But her name was Nadine, and I first met her at a training center for war-affected children in Bukavu in eastern Congo. And she was in her mid-teens. And I was furiously writing up a report in a back office, and I had my computer in front of me, and I had my cell phone beside me. And she came and knocked on my door and asked if she could sit down. And she was sitting right across from me when she explained how she had been in her village one afternoon. She'd been sick with malaria. And her mother handed her the money she needed to walk into town to buy the medication. And it was on that main road into town, full of cars and people and donkey carts, that she was surrounded by 3 young men. And they pinned her down, and they took turns raping her. And when she got up to run, one of them pulled out a hunting knife and sliced off the soles of her feet. Awful. And as she told me this story, she slipped her feet out of her shoes and showed me the very thick scars that ran from her heels to her toes on both sides. It was astonishing to me that she could even continue to walk. And then they raped her again. And she was eventually picked up by some children who helped her wash her clothes and who carried her home. And Aline didn't ever tell her mother what had happened. Because you see, in Aline's community, young girls who are raped and who are exposed to HIV have absolutely no hope of ever getting married. And they are literally sanctioned to a lifetime of poverty and isolation. 1 month after I had this conversation with Aline, on the same road into town, she was raped again. And the Congo is literally full of infants and mothers and grandmothers who have been savagely and brutally sexually assaulted as a result of the war in that country. So how might we tackle this global challenge? Well, certainly there is a critical need for ongoing and expanded treatment programs for rape victims, as well as protection initiatives for women and children. And I am proud to say that War Child is involved in those efforts in Eastern Congo, and we see the impact that it's having. But we cannot stop there, because there is another aspect to this narrative that has particular resonance here in Canada, which is home to 75% of the world's mining corporations. Because at the heart of this ongoing violence and instability, what has fueled it and what has financed it and what has abetted it has been a national as well as international struggle to control that country's vast resources. And those resources include many precious minerals and metals and stones and timber and gold and diamonds. And of particular importance to all of us in the industrialized world these days is a little known mineral called coltan. It's also called tantalum. And I'm going to ask for a show of hands because I know this is a very educated group. How many of you have heard of coltan? Excellent. So for those of you who don't know, it looks like black coal, and it is a conducting element. It isn't the only conflict resource obviously mined from the Congo, but it is one of the most significant because the Congo is believed to contain roughly 60 to 80% of the world's coltan deposits, and it is readily smuggled across borders. And it is relevant to us here because it can be found in all of our cell phones and our computers and our video game consoles. It essentially makes those electronics run faster. And the illegal and legal as well mining of such resources in the Congo has contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to rebel groups and Congolese military groups and mercenaries and other itinerant rapists operating in that part of the country. And those who doubt the connection between the mining sector in eastern Congo and what is called rape with extreme violence, which is exactly what Aline experienced, I would refer you to a fantastic study that came out at the end of 2009 and was published in the Public Library of Science, where doctors who were treating rape victims in eastern Congo, they did a classic demographic analysis. This is how we found out about Typhoid Mary. Same type of approach. So they took people that they were treating, and they asked them one question. They asked them where the rape had taken place. Thousands of women. And they plotted that on a map. And then they took another map of the mining areas. And they put the two together. And guess what they found? They found consistently that the closer you got to the mining areas, the higher the incidence of rape with extreme violence, which is exactly what Aline experienced. It involves gang rape and the amputation of parts of a girl's anatomy. One of the last things that Aline said to me that afternoon as I was getting ready to leave, she turned to me in French and she said, "Tout ça c'est pour toi." All of this is for you. On meurt pour rien. We die for nothing. Now, some have argued that the rape narrative coming out of the Congo has overtaken all conversations about this conflict and has become akin to a kind of voyeurism. You know, I disagree. I think that it remains a sad reality that too few understand the connections between conflict, impunity, and foreign interests in the Congo and elsewhere, and Congolese women especially are asking for public attention and pressure to be brought to bear. And we do them a disservice when we claim it's enough already and then try to force these conversations off the agenda. Because we can be, and I'm wrapping up here in about 2 minutes, we can be connected to the subjugation of women and girls, often by the very things that we do every single day. Every time we pick up the phone, every time we email our friends, every time we make unwise investment decisions and allow others to make those decisions for us, and every time we confess, every time we profess, rather, our undying love for one another in the form of a conflict diamond. And I haven't even mentioned oil. You know, Canadian mining companies are implicated in 4 times as many transgressions internationally, human rights and labor violations, as the next 2 biggest offenders, which are Australia and India. And yet we have no overarching policy in this country governing the behavior of our international corporations operating in unstable parts of the world. It is nothing less than shameful. And I began this afternoon by saying that global health should not be narrowly defined because it is a complex narrative that is too often poorly understood. There are no easy answers. There are no quick fixes. And to effectively challenge these underlying assumptions when it comes to global health, we must, all of us, endeavor as a priority to become more policy literate, and to understand the many threads that bind us to violence and instability in other parts of the world, and to vigorously advocate for a renewed and strengthened aid policy, none of which will be easy. A climate of fear has regrettably, this is why I began with a disclaimer, a climate of fear has regrettably, but not surprisingly, enveloped our NGO sector, our non-governmental sector here in Canada, whereby the penalties for speaking out can be swift and sustained, which is why all of you here, I hope, will also consider providing financial support to organizations that are doing this kind of work, because I can assure you we all desperately need it, and it is vitally important. But aid organizations have a responsibility here too, because we must be more than the custodians or subcontractors of corporate and political will when it comes to these issues, because we can never succeed in advancing global health while so much of the story remains untold, or worse, muted in that appeasement. The road ahead will be difficult, though I don't believe it will prove to be impossible. And to that end, I want to wish you all the greatest success. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.